Testing, 1, 2, 3. Hello, may I have your attention, please? May I have your attention, please? We're ready to begin with our program. Hello, and welcome to Gallaudet's celebration of DPN 30 years. 30 years of Deaf President Now. I'm William Innes. I teach in the history department here. And first, to open, I would like to extend our sincere thanks to our Sorensen sponsor. Can I get David Letkowitz to come to the stage and share a few remarks as our sponsor? Hello, everyone. Hello, hello. 30 years ago, I stood on this very spot. I was a student here 30 years ago. When, anybody remember who told us to all go gather on the field?
Fred.
Was it Fred I see over there? Harvey Goodstein. I see somebody saying, do you remember this? I stood right on this very spot, being urged along with everyone else out into the field, and off we marched. 30 years have passed since that time, almost the blink of an eye. Yesterday, we mourned the loss 50 years ago of Dr. Martin Luther King, a day of history and remembrance, and I was struck by that. And thinking about how we also carry a legacy of 30 years celebrating this momentous civil rights achievement. Thank you so much. I look forward to 45 and 50 years to come. We do have two large gifts. Just after this gathering, we're going to have a reception, at which point we'll have a raffle I'd like you all to be aware of until I believe 2:30, at which point we'll do drawings for two gifts at our booth. Two Sorensen sponsored gifts. Thank you. First of all, I have to extend my sincere apologies to all of you because we have scheduled this in conflict with the wonderful event outside. You'll see everybody wearing orange in a suicide prevention awareness event, and we try to avoid the conflict, but we're unable to. We do also stand in support of that event, and if at any time anybody is searching for support for any of these issues, please see our campus resources. We want to give you that support. You are all famous right now. Facebook Live is streaming this as we gather. And our last panel, I believe, was tuned in. 60,000 people watched the streaming presentation. At the conclusion of the event, just around the corner here, we'll have a reception, as well as a special book that is on sale here through Gallaudet University Press. Famed book on the Deaf President Now movement, authored by Jack Gannon, who wanted to be here to be with us to sign books, but was unable to due to declining health. So we have a total, what am I told, 25 signed copies that have been signed by the author that are going to be available for sale there. And I'm delighted now to introduce our university provost, Dr. Carol Erding, to welcome you all today.
Good afternoon. It feels like yesterday to me, just 30 years ago. How many of you in this room were on campus 30 years ago? Many of us can remember very clearly, just like it happened yesterday. I'm here today to welcome you all on behalf of Gallaudet University. The president is away, and she is probably watching the live streaming of this event, and she has asked me to bring her warm welcome to all of you here in person and online. We are very excited to be here today for this wonderful panel. These panelists represent the theme of this year's DPN 30th Celebration panel series. The theme being the unspoken, unrecognized, unsung heroes of the Deaf President Now movement, the backbone of the deaf civil rights movement. And here are just some of the people involved. We see people on the front lines, the leaders, the organized, but there are many people working behind the scenes that we often don't notice or don't know of. And today's panel represents all of the everyday people that made that movement successful. And these unsung heroes may not have received their credit due, but now we are beginning to recognize all involved in the success of DPN. Why is this so important? Because their stories as unsung heroes are equally important as anyone else's. Their stories increase the inclusivity of all stories and enhances the visibility of DPN and the varying perspectives and varying experiences that we want to acknowledge moving forward. And that is our hope for the future. That 5 years from now, when we gather or when we celebrate DPN 50, that our narratives will be much richer and inclusive of all. We are very proud of our Gallaudet community, and this panel reflects alumni, staff, and students. We are very grateful to all of you on the panel. Sunny, Yoon, Debbie, and Dick, for joining us here today to tell your stories. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carol. Hello, everyone. Hello. "30 years ago, I too stood here, and in fact, I remember sitting in the bleachers just in front of me. And at that time, I was not a student nor an employee. I came here to serve as an alum, and I just so happened to be here during that week. I arrived on Sunday evening, and as you'll hear further, we thought that we were going to engage only for Sunday evening. I had no idea it would last an entire week and that I wouldn't go home for a week. This is my pin. This is 30 years old. I wore this here in this room. Now this pin on my right side is, of course, very new. I'd like to take a moment to introduce our panelists. We'll start with Debbie Trapani. She was a student during the protest. We also here have Dick Moore. He was an employee and, he was an alum and also working in the area. We have Sunny Ingram, who was both an alum and employee. And Yoon Lee. He was a student. It was his first semester. Thank you for coming, all of you. And I'd also like to introduce the MCs.
I see there's a question. The fourth demand, no reprisals. You can see that fourth demand was met because I'm still here. There were no reprisals. And I hope that nothing comes up from today that still covers me, no reprisals.
We got you, Debbie. We have our 3 MCs, and they all will be seniors, right? One is a senior and one will become a senior, all majoring in deaf studies. This is Angel Cloud.
Hello, everyone.
And Lauren Leffler.
Hi there.
And Julia Mills.
Hello.
All yours. Enjoy.
Thank you. Thank you. Hello, everyone. As MCs, we want to share a little bit of the history and context of DPN and its 30 years of celebration now. And then we'll dive into the questions for our panelists. So, next slide. Day one of this historical moment. Sunday night, just before Deaf President Now, we had the group of 4 leaders who were coming here to see, from dinner, coming to see the announcement of the next election, and expected that to be all that there was. But then suddenly there was the group that took over the gates, and when the announcement from the board was there, at 8 o'clock, the Board of Trustees had selected their choice and announced that to the students, and were surprised by the chaos that ensued. The students were obviously very upset at the time, and that same night, Gary Tulane stood up, ready to have the students rally and march, but then the officers came and said there were no permits to march, and we didn't have the right to march without such a permit. So we began engaging with the police there that day. And Gary Olson began to engage with the police and gathered us together to march nonetheless. And we have an image over here. Let's see, there's Gary Olson right there when he's telling everybody, go ahead, go, march. And then you can see the pamphlets that everybody was carrying and the billboards announcing this selection of the first woman president, Elizabeth Zinser. And there, they were burning those announcement papers en masse. And so they had a list of 4 demands that they said had to be met as at the end of the Deaf President Now movement. First, the selection of Deaf President, that Zinser would be removed. Secondly, that Spillman must also resign from the board as chair. Third demand was that the Board of Trustees be comprised by of a majority of deaf board members. And also that all faculty, staff, and students would face no reprisals for their involvement in the protest. So on the next day, and this is quite well known, Gary Olson, Bummy, Bernstein, Frank Turk, Alan Sussman, and Greg Leibach set up some funds to be able to support the Deaf President Now protest. And the president of the student body government at the time was Greg. And all of the hearing graduate students actually came and were interpreting, taking care of phone calls to help in the movement as well.
On the 4th day, on March 9th, there were many events occurring at the same time. Student leaders were having a private meeting with Zinser. Jane Spillman had a press conference. There were negotiations between students and police to ensure that there were no one arrested. After the press conference with Zinser, faculty and staff gathered here and at Elstad, and they voted on these 4 demands. Dr. I. King Jordan later was announced announced his support of the board's decision. And here are some images from the press conference and also the students meeting with Zinser off campus. On day 5, March 10, this is an incredible day because this is when Greg Leibach was interviewed by Ted Koppel on ABC's Nightline, as well as Marlene Matlin and Dr. Zinser, and they had a conversation. And there was one line, then Ted Koppel had asked Zinser if she felt like she was a puppet for Spillman, and she clearly showed that she was emotional and upset. So it was a very powerful experience.
Then Friday normally would have been spring break, but students stayed. They stayed to continue the protest, and you see the famed banner, "We Still Have a Dream," a take on Martin Luther King's statement in their own march. And that's the actual banner that was used from that march, and we're eternally grateful for being able to use that in ours. Borrowed from Howard University. Let me give you a moment to read the slide. Day 7 dawned, and prior to that, NTID and RIT had bused other students and deaf people here to assist in the efforts. And the Board of Trustees was meeting that day to discuss the several days of protests having gone on, and they were meeting in Old Gym to discuss their feelings and reactions to the board and their reactions to the DPN protest. And they were receiving letters, phone calls from all over about DPN and discussing whether or not the protest should continue. And hats off to the board for dealing with that all that day. And then Sally Gallaudet Swift told Spillman, who was the granddaughter-in-law of Gallaudet, that Edward Minor Gallaudet would turn over in his grave if this protest were to continue. And then that brought us to day 8, a momentous celebration. Zinser was no longer president, and I, King Jordan, would become president. It was announced at last. Students were thrilled, and everyone was elated across the crowd.
They met the 4 demands. The first was that they chose I, King Jordan, as president of the university. Also, that Spillman resigned, which she did. That the board would convene with a 51% majority of deaf members. And at that time, Phil Braven was chosen as the chair of the Board of Trustees. And also, faculty and staff would meet no reprisals. And they were all met. Wonderful. We have some questions for you all. We'd like to ask you for some information about yourselves and introduce yourselves, and then we have some questions for you.
We'd like to ask you all to answer this question. What was your role at the time of DPN? What year were you?
Well, I'll start. I was a student that year. And mind you, I was a student that year, but the SBG president was Tim Raris, and then later Greg Leibach. So Tim Raris had a special aide to the president, and I served in that post at the time. That was my role that year. And then when DPN started and the search for the next president, I was involved from that point forward.
Hello, I'm Dick Moore, and I came to represent the Washington Post, and the Washington Post was very much in support of the movement. During that year, I was an employee of the Washington Post, and it was incredible. My name is Norman Ingram. People know me as Sunny. I was here as an employee in the maintenance department, and I worked also for what used to be called the physical plant and is now facilities. I'm happy to be here today. Thank you.
Hello, hello. I had just come from CSUN. I had transferred over there for my first year here, and I worked for Tower Clock. I was the photographer for the Tower Clock magazine. So as fall progressed into the protest, I was asked to come and document it for those days, and I did so over the protest. Yep.
Thank you, everyone. Next question. Where are all of you from?
I was born and raised in California and now live in Maryland. But yep, born and raised in California. Go Fremont. If you need to know, Fremont, all the way.
I was born and raised in Kentucky and lived in Maryland for many years and now live in Delaware.
St. Louis.
I was born in St. Louis, Missouri, home of the Arch, and then a few years later moved to Michigan and graduated from school there and then enrolled in Gallaudet in 1970. And now I live in Florida.
Well, I was originally from Korea, Seoul, came here as a lad of 10, and then came to LA at 10, and then continued until I came into Gallaudet. And I now live just outside of Riverside in a small town in the middle of nowhere.
He's a tough man to get a hold of. We're very happy that you're here today and everyone else as well.
That's my former student.
At the Riverside School. He's an incredible teacher. He has always talked about how important Gallaudet is, and he is the reason I'm here today. Our next question. What are you all doing now?
Well, I'm now director of bilingual education at the Clare Center here on the campus. And prior to that, I was a principal at the Kindle School, and I'm now director of bilingual education. Yep. Just started that new role in January.
I'm retired, but still working as a photographer. I am also retired, enjoying Florida, and I haven't quite found a new hobby yet. Still looking for one.
I'm retired at CSDR Riverside and used to teach the TV class for several years. Now I work with a small college doing some curriculum development coordination.
So now I'd like to ask some individual questions of the panelists. Yoon, can you please speak to what you were doing at that time?
How long do I have? Okay.
Whatever you need.
Now, I'd grown up going to mainstream schools, public schools, and didn't really have a strong sense of deaf identity at the time. But I'd gone to youth leadership camp, I was 14 when I met Tim Raris and Greg Leibach and met all of these folks. I don't know if you know these names, but it was amazing meeting them. Then graduated high school, went to CSUN for a while, but Gallaudet called me. So I transferred out after 1 year, came here in the fall, and as the semester was going along, I decided to work for the yearbook. And I'd been doing so to no great surprise when this protest broke out. And on the first day of the protest, I didn't really know what this was all about. You know, I really didn't. I didn't have that sense of deaf identity. Maybe you could call me a mind that had been colonized by hearing norms, so it struck me. And then I went there with my press badge, taking my pictures without a clue what I was documenting at the time. I had hardly an idea. I didn't know who any of these people were. I didn't know hardly at all what was happening. But there was a photographer that found me there. And then a whole bunch of photographers were there following my lead there. And it was such a hassle, but I went.
They were trying to steal your pictures.
Trying to document everything I could see. But then we were here in this very room 30 years ago, and I'll never forget. Who is that? Oh, yeah, the fellow. I remember him being right there. Yeah, taking pictures Wait, let me back this up for a moment. So I was at the dorm asleep initially when the fire alarms were pulled and everybody was roused at once. And so we came here and I grabbed my gear, and I was the only photographer who had gear at the time. All the other photographers lived off campus, lived far away, so I was the only person that had my photography equipment. So I felt doubly responsible to take pictures of everything happening. And I was stressed trying to make sure I didn't miss a thing. And then I remember the provost and everyone was saying, go to the hotel. I didn't know what they were talking about. And so off people went. And I went back to my dorm to get more film. Back then, we had actual film canisters. I don't know if you know them, but you had to insert them, wind them, and protect them. And it was a lot more work. So I had to go back to the dorm, get more of that, carry a big duffel bag full of it. And I had my press badge, got to the hotel. And there was a huge cadre of photographers in their press corps. And then those photographers remembered that I'd been the one at Gallaudet to help them get access, so they parted like the Red Sea to allow me to make my way in there to get my shots. And I got some amazing shots that day. And one of the famous pictures of King and his wife, I don't know if you know that picture I'm talking about. In that very moment, I shot that shot. I was an unknown photographer, but by the time that evening ended, I came back to, it wasn't the H&B, it was the Ely building over there. And when we all came back, I came to the dark room and processed that. It was 3 o'clock in the morning and I was exhausted processing the film. But I got that, it was published in the Buff and Blue, and then that picture was plastered all over the world. I had no idea it was going to go the world over. Then the march, and let's see, well, no, I'll try to keep it short, but then, and then that summer I was in an accident and lost my girlfriend there. She was on the volleyball team and was going to the Olympics, but I was in the hospital for 3 months, and when I came out in the hospital on Thanksgiving, I think it was, I told my parents, I've got to go back to Gallaudet. They thought, you just gotten out of the hospital, you had no business doing that, it's cold and winter there. But the protest had lit a fire in me for Gallaudet that was never slaked. So I decided to go and see if I could get back. And my roommate was somebody that I already knew. I was able to come back in. And the protest really saved me. It really did. It was a shot in the arm for me. It filled me with energy and vigor, and it was great for me. And I felt the love and support of everybody. I remember when I came back initially in a wheelchair, how much support I got from just the milling crowds, everyone there. It was amazing, and I remember that. And I was asked to come and take a picture with King at that time, and so I was the Asian in the wheelchair there in the picture. But that summer, that image went all over the world. And everywhere I went, I saw that picture of me, famous once again, and yet another picture that I had no idea was going to be such a thing. And as a humble man, I am so inspired to have the opportunity to be here today.
Wow, what an important role in history. And you have documented everything for everyone. Thank you so much for your efforts. Sunny, we'd like to ask you now what your role was during the protest and how it inspired your deaf identity.
Sure, absolutely. I remember on Friday evening, I was working, and there were a group of other employees who were hearing and not signing, and they were talking about something, and I didn't know what they were talking about. At that time, I didn't have many deaf colleagues, and I was trying to observe this conversation, and they asked me, what was going on, what I was doing, and I said, it's time for us all to go home. It's 3 or 3:30. And I wanted to know, though, what my colleagues were talking about. So a colleague of mine who had some signing, he was a painter at that time, he tried to share with me the fact that Gallaudet had appointed their president and that it was a hearing person. And I could not believe my eyes. So I went home, and remember at that time, I did not know that there was any organization underway. Later that evening, I was talking with my wife. I turned on the news, and my wife catches the attention of the image on the screen, and we weren't sure what it was, but we knew there was something. So the next morning, my wife worked for the Park Services, and she went to work, and she specifically worked for the Frederick Douglass House. I had no idea what I was driving into. And when I got on campus, I was going to make a right from West Virginia into Kendall, and I saw all of these students rallying at the gates and police cars, and I thought, what is going on? And all of the buses had been hot-wired, and I wondered, who did that? And then I drove around the corner to Florida Avenue, and I saw that the gates were also closed down there. So then I thought, well, I have to find my way onto campus, and I looked for overflow parking area. And when I went over to the overflow parking area, I saw another campus employee and approached them. Mm-hmm. And they were concerned about us not being able to enter the campus. And they were concerned about the protest itself. And they were angry that the students and faculty were protesting, and this person was actually cussing the protesters out. And this person was not a member of the signing or deaf community, and that angered me. So I took my way to the front gates, and I gathered with the students, and they said that I couldn't enter. And the reason why I couldn't enter was because I had my uniform on for the physical plant where I worked. They knew then that I was an employee. So I watched. And I listened, and I stayed for a few hours. And I went home. I shared the events with my wife. I informed her of the protest of Zinser as having been appointed the president of the university. We both agreed that it didn't make sense, but it hadn't truly hit me yet. The next day, I wore my regular clothes. I came to campus. I went to that same overflow parking lot, and I made my way down to the front gate. There was a pretty good number of students there who asked me, "Are you in support of the protest?" And I said to myself, well, what else could I say? I'm just like you. Absolutely, I support this protest. And they gave me access. And that was inspiring and powerful. And I remember the first thought I had was that I had to go to the physical plant building. And when I entered the building, I saw my colleague Homer. He asked me for help. And I saw that a few of our Latino colleagues were unsure of what to do and in a sense paralyzed. And they were asking for help and guidance. They asked us to check each building to make sure that everything was okay, that nothing had been damaged. And I said, you know what? All of these buildings are chained up. I can't enter the buildings. What are you thinking? Right? But there was this one building. It was the Student Union building. Do you remember that? The SAL, the Student Union building. So I had access to that space, and I went in there, and I also went to check to see if the bathrooms were okay, the space was okay, and I was pleasantly surprised to see that everything was in perfect order. Everybody was taking care of one another and the physical space. I realized this was a non-violent protest, that it was being maintained that way. I informed my supervisors of this. I said, everything looks great. You have nothing to worry about. You can stay here or you can go home. It's your choice. But see you later. I'm going to go and protest with the students. So I took my way back up to the gates, and it's important to remember that while there were many students and faculty and staff at the front lines, there were so many people behind them. And it was those people that I engaged in conversation with, and those are the people that told me what was going on. And it didn't even matter what my status was, that I was an employee. I was a member of the community, and I got involved, and it was amazing. We continued through Wednesday. I remember seeing this one gentleman on Wednesday. He was a postal employee. He delivered mail, and he brought money. And when he brought that money, in order to support the DPN fund, that then created a ripple effect for many others to then provide funding and support for the protest. There's also Mitch Soiter. Do you all remember Mitch? He was a homeless activist for DC, and he also came to the gates. That was incredible. That was meaningful. That told me how important our movement was as deaf people, and that we mattered and that we were of value, because he was a minority just like us, and he saw that, and so he worked with us and engaged with us for a few days. I went home for a few days. I came back, and they said, hey, we've got a deaf president now. Congratulations. It was time. It was time.
Thank you for sharing that. So my next question is actually for Debbie, and it's a two-part question. We'd like to know what your role was in the protest, and also what were the ribbons? What was your role in that? And if you could explain what the colors signified.
Okay, should I stand? Okay. So, my role for the Deaf President Now movement. Well, you have to know that there were Tim Rares, there was Greg Leibach, there was Jerry Covell, and Brigitta, and each of them had armbands. And I know that they all had red armbands, the people at the very top of their respective groups. And then I'm trying to remember, there were 4 different cadres. Leslie, do you remember? Let's see, right. So we had, okay, that helps. We had the green, that's right, thank you. So we had, the leaders were red. The leaders overall wore red armbands. And then the other 3 groups, that was Greg, and then the other 3 leaders wore the blue. And then there were yellow armbands too for those who were doing a lot of the grunt work. Because remember, we didn't have pagers back then. Everything was TTY and relay, and so we had to communicate messages out by physically going out, pulling fire alarms, grabbing crowds, and spreading word by word of mouth. And so we had 3 assistants to each of those leaders, 3 students who worked directly under each of those 4 leaders. They also were given corresponding armbands, and they reported directly up that chain of command and did their work. And so we came up with that color code. There was also the green. Green were for those who were bringing and handling the donations that were coming in to support the protest. Those were the green armband folks. And then, let's see, my role at the time was whatever else was needed, anything else. And so I did a little bit of everything. We had meetings morning, noon, and night, and sometimes 3 and more a day. And so they needed scribes. So I took notes from many of those meetings. for our student gatherings, for the alumni and staff gatherings. I took copious notes where are those notes, I wonder? I can look at home, see if any of them are there, maybe in the archives. I've looked at home some and haven't found them, but I took huge amounts of notes for meetings throughout the days of the protest. And then also, we had to have a communications group. So, you know, for the rally, we could gather people in large groups, but it required a lot of running around to try to spread the word for that. So a friend and I came up with the idea of checking in with PPD in the physical plant. So they had vans there all in a row that PPD left unlocked. I'm just saying. No reprisals come of this, right? Okay, so PPD at the time left the vans unlocked with the keys inside. So we all got in, we took them and drove them around, and that became our messenger vehicles, and in fact, transportation vehicles. We were transporting people around in our own little municipal bus system. So, time came for the rally, and we were told to gather everyone, so we did. We gathered them all, and some of those very people, I'm not naming all the names, but we all went and conveyed and taxied everybody off and dropped people off in their various dorms. And at the agreed upon time, you know, so we dropped everybody off at 8, and then at the agreed upon time, we pulled fire alarms in every single dorm, got everybody out all at once. Then we were able to gather them to the central hub of what used to be Hughes Gym. And you know it stands where the SLCC now stands? Yeah, but that was the best gathering spot on campus at the time for a large enough group. It was sort of amphitheater style, so we could gather people up. So we did chants and rallies at the time, and we would then use that hub to communicate plans when we came up with the plans for the lockdown. We gathered the chains and all that. Let's see, it started on Monday. We originally locked down campus, and then went to Old Gym. Actually, Old Gym became our headquarters. That was our communication central, our headquarters. And then the administration ended up cutting the physical wires for the phones to cut us off from phone service. I don't remember how that originally happened, but we finagled another phone at the back of Old Gym that we protected with our lives. We had interpreters too who were gathered there to make phone calls for us, to interact with the press and make phone calls for us. So that was one of our areas that we had to lock down and secure, and so we also had to secure each of the gates, the 6th Street Gate, the Kendall Gate, and so forth. We closed all of them, chained them. The only gate that was open for entrance was at the very front. And my job throughout the week was to convey people around in the van and also to man the front gate. When we were getting training from alumni and faculty who were amazing for us at the time, we had one lawyer, Jeff Rosen, who came and gave us some advice on how to engage. So anyway, we at the front had a blockade. Any student could come in, but if you were not an American citizen, you had to sit behind the American citizens to protect you. If you had a green card, you could go to the back. Or if you had no record, you could go to the back. Those at the front could more easily afford to be arrested. And they talked about the importance of it being a peaceful demonstration and to articulate ourselves well. So we had lots of chants, signed chants that we did as a group that helped to get the message across. And they told us to stay non-confrontational, to share our thoughts, the things we wanted to communicate peaceably with police and reporters. And so I did that. I did a lot of scribing, a lot of go-to, and transporting people up to the gates. And in fact, you can see in that middle image there on screen, you see one person from the back. That's me, actually. Yeah. And so I was acting largely as the secretary for the SBG at the time as well, and then I was asked by Tim to stay here in that position because I already knew SBG and the ins and outs of it, so I stayed scribing throughout that week and working on the ribbon committees. Oh, I also have to say that prior to that, I'd always been engaged with SBG, the Student Body Government. It was just behind the SAC. I don't know if that's still where it is. Is that where it is? Oh, okay, in the Ely building. All right, so, and there was a lot of vibrant discussion leading up to these events. And I remember often talking with Jerry Covell, who was adamantly in support of deaf people being able to do this now, and that any kind of complaints about hearing candidates being more qualified be damned. And he really was so passionate about it that when the time came for the protest, and it came about, in fact, the campus was littered with those yellow announcements. I remember it was just littered in a sea of yellow announcements, and everybody off they went to march to the hotel. And I called my parents are hearing, and I called my parents to tell them what was happening, that Gallaudet was going to protest, and that I was involved. And I remember my parents just cautioning me, saying that if you go to jail, they're not bailing you out. And this is all through, not Relay, through TTYs directly. So I thought to myself, you know what? I have two families. I've got my family that's hearing at home where I've grown up, but this is also my family, this community, and I'm diving in head first all week. And you know, the people with the yellow armbands, I was one of them who was out there making sure that everybody was safe, that they had what they needed, that we had our gateways locked and guarded. And deaf people had to take a stand. They had to speak out. That was a pivotal moment in my life. It was that very phone call where I was cautioned. I decided to throw caution to the wind and dive in, and the rest is history.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
You know, this really gives you an opportunity to get an idea of what deaf people went through and how you can overcome many obstacles of experiences. This is a sign of all of the history and the work that deaf people have been engaged in as leaders. To know that deaf people don't have to always follow that hearing norm and the hearing society's way of being, that they can create that sense of being themselves and take leadership in their identity and role.
So now we have a question for Dick. You designed the layouts for the Washington Post in your work there as a printer, so we'd like to ask you to speak to what your role was and also why you designed the layout the way that you did.
On the first day, on Sunday, there were 4 of us, Washington Post employees. We were all deaf, and we were on our way to work. But we decided to stop by campus first to find out who had been selected as president. Was it a hearing person or a deaf person? And as we drove up to campus, we saw a box set out on the sidewalk with a pile of yellow papers announcing the selection of a hearing president. And you saw people just explode around this announcement. And papers are flying everywhere, and people started to gather up at the school. You know, I wish that I had taken a piece of paper for myself, one of those flyers, but I was thinking I had to get to work. I had to be at work on time. Those of us at the Washington Post were in full support of the protest. We talked about it at work, and later in the evening, another gentleman, Chuck Bourbon, came to speak to me and said, hey, the deaf folks are marching to the Capitol right now, to the hotel. And so we decided to ask our supervisors if we could be released And we even asked, if we should come back and work later, but the supervisor released us freely to go and protest in this movement. And so we arrived at the Mayflower Hotel. We saw the board. We saw Phil Braven. We saw this announcement. It was a lively discussion. People were angry. People were ready to make plans for the movement. But I went back to work, and I started to work on the layout of the front page of the Washington Post. That was my job. Each Sunday, I was working on this front page, and I saw pictures of deaf people. That was not my choice. The editor of the Post had chosen these images. It's they who choose the images, and then I lay them out. And there were other deaf employees who were looking at this layout with me. And they said, this term hearing impaired is not suitable for the front page. It's not fitting of the current movement. Remember, it's not about not being able to hear. It's really about being deaf. And so we changed the language collectively to deaf. And the editor understood, and they made that change. And at that time, there were over 100 deaf employees at the Washington Post. Of course, that number has changed now. There are more hearing people than deaf, but at that time, there was a large number of deaf people at the Post. Now there are none. They want you, though. The Washington Post wants you, graphic designers, those of you who are in this type of communications work. There are a lot of hearing people who work there who can sign, so they are looking for you. Now, back to my story. I thought that, as a photographer, I didn't have access to the protests and to the march. In fact, my car had broken down that very same week. And I was creating a layout on the Post, and I see the words saying that this is history in the making. And I'm feeling, I gotta go. I have to be out there. And I kept the original proof from that layout. And I saved it through the week, and I just looked at it, and I thought about what I wanted to do. I chose very specific images that I knew would be able to fit on the layout in this front page. And you'll see here on the screen is the front page. So this is the article from the first day, and then the second day is below here where Professor Ennis is pointing, and then the third day. And then we move on to when she resigned, to the announcement. And there's a date. If you could tell me, what is the date that you see here? March 7 to March 14. March 7 to March 14. Right? So this is on the front page, but it tells the whole story. Rather than save 7, 8 days worth of paper, you have one front page paper with the entire week's events. Most importantly, after the movement, we got more respect and understanding from our hearing counterparts. It was so clear, the change in attitude and perspective of deaf people. I remember growing up and having people look at me a certain way as a deaf member of the community. And that experience shifted tremendously after the movement. It was an incredible movement. We should be all very grateful to DPN.
Absolutely. And as we know, the deaf community was more isolated prior to the DPN movement, and it was with that movement that the whole world recognized us.
I'd like to add one more thing. I have to brag. My 3 children are in this image here on the right. My son is Sean. He is a Gallaudet alum. Next to him are my 2 daughters who are hearing. Sean became one of the leaders during the second protest. And so he certainly learned a lot from the first protest and brought his experience and knowledge to the 2006 protest. He was one of the leaders, and my 2 daughters are also very involved in the deaf world. And again, the movement was a great influence on them.
Thank you for sharing that.
I think it's important for us all to note, as we're listening to each of our stories here, I'm seeing a theme, and that is that we were all willing to serve, right? We didn't have any expectation for reciprocation. We got involved, we served, and you have to remember that even though there are people at the front line, there are always people behind them rallying and doing the work. And DPN also taught us a lot as well, even though we weren't at the front line.
I completely agree with that sentiment. Yoon, we'd like to ask you a question. You had mentioned that you were a student photographer at that time. How did you feel with the fact that you only had about 10 to 15 film rolls?
Well, that whole week, I knew that, actually on the very last day, I really wondered, is this going to be the end of it? Are they going to pick a deaf president? I still didn't know. It was uncertain. I felt like they would. I really did. So I decided, okay. So I came to bring I brought a 12-roll set, just to be sure. And I felt pretty confident, but I didn't know what picture was going to end up being the most important. The most important one turned out to be the one of King and his wife at the moment of the announcement. But throughout that week, I was so worried about film. What happened? What to do if it got wet, if a dog ate it, whatever. I kept on resupplying my film, and I just blew through film, and my camera, and my bag. And there were a lot of hearing photographers who were professional photographers who lived that day in, day out, and I learned from them. They had all kinds of equipment and bags and lenses, and I had one little camera, humble as it was. But I learned what professionalism was right then. I learned what it meant to live, eat, and breathe with that bag by your side. It is your life. I learned that. Yeah, I learned that sleeping in the dorm. I got to sleep in the warm dorm when some of them didn't. But anyway, you asked me how I felt just having those 12 rolls. It was such a responsibility. I remember, I was so paranoid about the safety of those. What happens if the chemicals don't work? What happens if anything goes wrong with those films? I was so grateful to have had the shots I got. I also want to add that we were so fortunate to have Soon that week. Without that documentation, we wouldn't have the records and images that we do have today. That was a history in the making. We couldn't rely on outside photographers catching all that. That was amazing. You created records of DPN. Thank you. Thank you. As a photographer, you got to think outside of the box and get a different shot. If I were not in the deaf community, just totally naive to the community, I wouldn't have gotten the best perspective shots. Being deaf gave me a vantage to take shots that were meaningful for our communities from our own perspectives, and somebody totally naive to the deaf community may not have gotten those same shots. You know, I didn't know who these people were. Being naive to who the leaders were made me get shots of everyone. But I got a lot of amazing shots that I didn't know were amazing in the moment. But the fact that I came here is kind of neutral and uninvolved was something that gave me a vantage point to take those images and capture as much as I did.
You know, this is the week that the world heard Gallaudet. And part of that is because of your images, Yoon. And you can actually see these images in the library. We're actually going to show a short video. We are saddened that Gannon couldn't come today, but we do have some film of him sharing his experience and also talking about the book that he published. The week the world heard Gallaudet.
Hello. My name is Jack Gannon. We were walking through the gates and so amazed to find that they were closed. And that was certainly an experience at Gallaudet. And we had been part of Gallaudet for so long. We were students, of course, at the time. But they wouldn't let us in because we were staff members. I worked with public relations and media. And my wife taught. And we were very surprised that we were no longer part of Gallaudet, so to speak. At least that was the impression that we got by not being permitted to come onto campus. And some people were allowed on campus. We were one of those who were not allowed on campus. So they turned us away from our home. What else could they do? So I wasn't overly concerned. Have a very strong bond with Gallaudet that I knew would continue, and I knew what was going on. But at the same time, I certainly recognized that Gallaudet had a point. They had a point. And it seemed that the time was coming, and that the change was on the horizon, and change was happening. Later, we went to North Carolina for an interview. And in North Carolina, we were unable to conduct the interview because they didn't sign, so we wrote back and forth. And they were very nice. They seemed to be friendly, warm. And I could certainly see what was happening. And at that time, it certainly had arrived that times were changing. We were invited then to their home, and from that, I was asked to write the book. I didn't go around saying these things. I recognized that there must be a reason So I was a bit surprised, but I was approached and asked to write this book. And it all fell together. And we shared the various points, different components that we were writing. We worked very hard to keep it open. And that's very much what it had to be. And that's what was the result. Book was published. Didn't get any criticism, and maybe I shouldn't advertise that, but we didn't. People agreed. Well, most people agreed. Some people didn't. And that's how it went. And I think the book helped Gallaudet. All of us look at one another clearly. All of the various constituents, teachers, students, that we need to move on. I, King Jordan, was the first deaf president. I actually worked with him. I knew him. I knew him as a person. And I actually expected that he was or would be stuck in the middle of everything that happened. And his quote that was shared in Chapel Hall when he was interviewed by reporters, and the quote escapes me right now. Deaf people. That's right, that's it. It even shocked us, our own deaf people. We were shocked that we can do anything except hear. The first time we heard that famous quote, but it was really true and very powerful. A powerful message, particularly for the rest of the world, that hearing people needed to learn that the world does have deaf people. So we have perspectives and differences, but there's always a way to come together and make a better world. And I really think that that is what Gallaudet University, what other colleges and universities are all about. Of course we know that it's not easy and change won't happen overnight. You have to work towards that goal of making things better.
I want to just give you the last few moments that we have, a moment to tell us anything you'd like to share with us to wrap up your recollections of the events. Deaf President Now impacted the lives of every deaf person. As a student, for me, I know that having grown up in a hearing family and gone to the Fremont School for the Deaf, here as a student, I was used to the status quo being what it was. The kinds of jobs that deaf people tended to get were the jobs that deaf people tended to get, and we thought of deaf people not so much as being the CEOs of companies and being in the leadership positions until they started appearing in leadership positions, and they do so now. My role models, even though there are so many role models in the deaf world now, there still haven't been enough until that point of DPN. That left me thunderstruck. People have since, we found deaf writers, deaf lawyers, deaf everything, and we've got deaf leaders now. And that tells us that we can do it all, that we can do even more than we've done. So in retrospect, it's amazing. I am privileged and honored to have been part of DPN. DPN has changed the landscape ever after. It's changed my own career path, my ability to progress and grow and learn from other people and be a leader. And it's created a new sensitivity, a new connection among us all. And my connections with everybody in my life are different because Deaf President Now happened. It was amazing. That day that we carried that banner, the Martin Luther King banner, "We Still Have a Dream," I am forever awed by that. That defined us as a movement. It wasn't a march, it wasn't a protest, it was a movement. And the truth of that is something that stuck with me. That is a gift that we were given in letting us use that banner that day. Recognize that we were about a civil rights movement. It was a profound moment in my life. Stunning. And so impressed with all of the work that we did and the work that persists. It still continues, that we're not done. We still have things our community needs, but we're marching towards progress. Dick, any last words?
I'd also like to add as well, the people who worked at the Washington Post were significantly impacted by the movement. Many deaf people at that point and beyond started to move up the ladder and were promoted to supervisory positions. They were very supportive of deaf individuals and the movement. They donated water and food. And there were actually a few women who had come to the campus and saw that the food was not in order and came to help us reorganize the way the food was set out and served. And those were people from the Washington Post. Those are some other unsung heroes. Thank you so much. DPN had such an incredible impact on me, and not only myself, but on so many of us. So many of us were young and didn't have the exposure that those of you have today, right? And then when we had that movement and we shook the world, people started moving forward in their careers and in their lives. They were promoted in their workplaces. Without DPN, I'm not so sure that would have happened, right? And that quote, "Deaf people can do everything except hear." Don't forget how many deaf people had already started that work and that movement behind the scenes and in history. And DPN allowed it all to come to the world stage.
Well, Deaf President Now has affected me personally, absolutely. Because I had my accident just after, and I imagined there was no life for me anymore. I was paralyzed, I was in my wheelchair. I didn't know what my life would be until I came back to Gallaudet. I worked hard, I studied, I graduated from Gallaudet, and sure enough, I got a job. I got a job with Deaf Mosaic, traveling around. I got to go to Alaska. I went with Mary. I see Mary up there. Hi, Mary. Hi, Barry. I remember that. You and I traveling to Alaska, doing film work. And then going back to California, I got to work for Dawn Sign Press. Are you familiar with them, the publishers? I worked for them, got to travel around, went to lots of places. And at the time, I was walking with a cane still at the time. So it was a trek, but people trusted me and believed in me and my ability to do my work. And I got to do that. I got to go to work for CSD, Communication Service for the Deaf. And You know, they flew me to China for 10 days to do film work in China. I've gotten to go everywhere and travel. And, you know, after the accident, my ability to travel the world and see the world was increased, in fact. I'm forever thankful to DPN. If it weren't for DPN and this community here, I might never have come back. DPN changed my life forever. And the fact that I'm married and here with my beautiful daughter right over there stems from that time. My point is that you don't give up. Don't. You may think you're in the darkest time of your life on some day, but the morrow looks ever brighter. There will be sun. There will be, if you work and toil away at it, you can. I'm serious. The first days might seem dark, but really, the first days of the protest seemed dark, but it shook the world. Gallaudet closed down and it changed everything. We couldn't believe that we could do what we were doing, but we did it nonetheless. The leaders emerged, and it came to pass. It was a dark moment that first day when we first got the news, and then the world rallied behind us. People came in from the world over to swell the movement's ranks until it came to be the most awe-inspiring time of our lives. I saw that change. I saw it through the course of the shots I took throughout that week. The smiles that began to appear on people's faces towards the end are something that I carry with me every day. Any challenge I face, I feel like I can overcome if I work hard enough at it. I feel like my life is a great success. I've been able to retire and enjoy my life thanks to all that happened then and Deaf President now. And now, at the very last, we have one surprise. As you're leaving, we have for each of you one of these broadsheets. And you can get one, thanks to Gallaudet, to take with you, one of these memorial broadsheets. Thank you so much, very much. As a historian, I am so struck by the richness and the quality of the stories. It is one thing to intellectualize a movement, but all of this intellectualization of the movement rests on the shoulders of the amazing work of all of these panelists and the other unsung heroes. Thank you so much. And do join us for our next and final panel, April 17th, 2 weeks from now, where the topic will be race and DPN, the unfulfilled legacy. And don't miss out on that amazing panel. Please do come in 2 weeks. Thank you.